I misplaced a few notes that I wanted to bring to you. And last week I mentioned the term Milo. And it's the citadel. And it was a man-made construction built in the terrace and was expanded in David and Solomon's reign, built for them. It was also a small city in Shechem. The word hiss, the definition for the word hiss means to whistle, to scorn. It describes a hissing or whistling of puzzlement. It is a word of rejection and mockery in some cases. To hiss also means to call for someone or something to come. There's another term that we talked about last week that I couldn't remember, and that was byword. And that word is found in chapter 9, verse 7. The byword means to taunt. You know, like little kids, nah, 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 nah. Refers to the scornful or jeering put down. Israel would become a taunt before the nations because of her disobedience, especially in the exile. And then there was some things called almug. These are trees. This is the only usage of these trees. These trees were from the distant land of Opha. They were perhaps red sandalwood or Lebanese trees. Scripture in verse 27 of chapter 10 calls them sycamore trees. The place of Ophir, O-P-H-I-R, is a name describing the area from which Solomon imported quantities of gold. The place was renowned for its fine gold to the nations. Its exact location is still a puzzle, but may have been in the south or southwest part of the Arabian Peninsula. And Brother Carrico mentioned that last week. Thanks, Sam, for that description of where this was located. Two other things that were mentioned that I failed to remember and bring to you was Chemosh. It refers to the chief god of the Moabites, Molech, as some call it, a pagan god of the Amorites, to whom, among other things, children were sacrificed. Go back to Numbers chapter 18, verse 21, and in Amos chapter 5, verse 26. The name means king, and possibly the consonants were combined with the vowels of the Hebrew word Boset, B-O-S-E-T, meaning shame, to produce Molech. Manasseh may have sacrificed his son to this god to avert the horrors of warfare. And we'll read about that 2 Kings chapter 23. Solomon was reduced to recognize this god. This is one of the gods that his wives and concubines brought to him. And the term apes, it refers to an exotic animal brought to Israel by ship from Tarshish, Spain, or merely large merchant ships. This touch of vanity added to the splendor of Solomon's king. As we ended last Lord's Day, Solomon's kingdom being divided because of his heart being given to sinful things. He didn't guard his heart as God had wanted him to. At the end of Solomon's reign, he had enemies. We first read of Hadad of Edom. Under the leadership of King David, with Joab and Abishai, who were killed when Solomon became king, the Edomites were severely beaten with all the men in the army killed. As a young boy, Hadad fled to Egypt, where he grew up and married the sister of Pharaoh's wife. When Hadad heard of King David's death, he offered a strong resistance to King Solomon's defenses. The second person that gave him trouble was Rezon of Samaria. He set up another strong resistance to Solomon by fortifying Damascus of the fleeing Hadadezer. He built enough men to the Israelites and take over the city of Damascus. This conflict restricted Solomon's control of that region. Last but not least, Jeroboam. Jeroboam was the son of Nebat of Ephraim. Jeroboam served Solomon as his building and repairing of the city and walls. The prophet Ahijah met Jeroboam on a trip to Jerusalem. Ahijah took new garment signifying the newness of the kingdom, tore it into 12 pieces. Ahijah gave Jeroboam 10 pieces and said, "Take the 10 pieces, for thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I will rend, tear up the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to you. But he shall have 1 tribe for the servant David's sake, and for Jeroboam's sake the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel." When Solomon heard of Ahijah's prophecy and Jeroboam's rebellion, Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam. Jeroboam fled to the house of Shishak in Egypt until Solomon's death. And that's where we left off last week. This week we start kind of a confusing part of the rest of Kings. It is divided. It is separated between a north and south border. And I'm going to try and keep these separate from, not from you, but for you, so that we can understand who's doing what and who's in charge of each individual section. Just remember, north and south, the north being Israel, the south section being Judah. Starting in chapters 12, introduction is, several of the underlying problems in Solomon's administration came to a head at his death. One may think that Solomon's glorious reign had no problems, but instead, he should recognize that those problems lay dormant under his strong hand rule and surfaced at his death. Here are some of the problems that Solomon dealt with. Tribal jealousy had surfaced in several previous occasions. Dissatisfaction with Solomon's high taxation existed. And final, the Davidic covenant was not accepted by all of Israel. Many Israelites were not ready to accept that the king would be a descendant of David for the life of the kingdom. With the death of Solomon, malcontents in Israel saw this as an opportunity for change. Beginning in chapter 12, verses 1 through 20. Although Jerusalem had accepted Rehoboam as the new king, not all Israel had. The strength of the monarchy was not so great as to be able to insist that all Israel come to Jerusalem to crown Rehoboam king. The lack of united acceptance of the monarchy is seen in Rehoboam's going to Shechem for Israel to crown and accept him as king. Sometimes before the meeting in Shechem, the northern tribes called Jeroboam home to his exile in Egypt. Jeroboam assembled with the tribes as they came to confront the newly appointed king Rehoboam. The men of Israel said, "Thy father made our yoke grievous, and now therefore make thou the grievance service of their father, and his heavy yoke which he put upon us lighten, and we will serve thee." What he's talking about is the request of a lighter yoke can only be understood as a complaint about taxation and conscripted labor. Rehoboam asked 3 days to counsel with his advisors about their request. You would think, after having all those wives and concubines and a harem, that Solomon would have more than one child that he wanted to talk about. But all the scripture says is this one person, Rehoboam. and this other gentleman, Jeroboam, which we'll read about in a moment. Rehoboam consulted two different groups with different views of what the king's position should be. First, the elderly group advised him that the king should be servant to the people. They advised him to speak good words to the people and commit himself to their servant, and the nation would be loyal to his leadership. Second, the younger group advised him to rule with autocratic authority, typical the Oriental monarchs. They advised him to say to his people, "My little finger shall be thicker than my father's loins." What he's talking about is his little finger being thicker than Solomon's waistline. And now, whereas my father did hide you, and now, whereas my father did lade you with a heavy yoke. This word laid is almost self-explanatory. It indicates putting a load or bearing on some kind of, on the people or animals. Father did lade you with a heavy yoke. I will add to your yoke. My father hath chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. These scorpions that he's talking about is not the scorpion's little bug or animal we know about that has the stinger over his back, but it's kind of like the scourge they used on Jesus. It had metal or some kind of bones or stuff in the ends of a whip. After 3 days, the tribes assembled, and Rehoboam answered them roughly, following the advice of the younger counselors. Historians recognize the hand of God's providence in Rehoboam's answer that the prophecy of Ahijah might be fulfilled. These younger gentlemen that he's talking about are people that Rehoboam grew up with. They were used to being in the castle and in amongst the courts and eating on the gold plates that Queen Sheba noticed that was there. They drank from golden cups. They ate with a golden fork and a golden spoon. Everything in the king's castle was gold. And these guys, these younger guys, were used to that and thought that it would be taken away from them, which wouldn't have done them any, would have been all right with me. When the northern tribes heard Rehoboam's arrogant and insolent answer, "What portion hath we in David?" These are the very similar to the words to Sheba in 2 Samuel 20, verse 1. All of the tribes rebelled against Judah. Remember, Judah's the second one. Judah and Benjamin are the only two tribes that Rehoboam have for him. Rehoboam ignored their refusal and tried to subject the tribes by sending his tax collector Adoram to collect the tribute. The tribes refused to pay their taxes and stoned Adoram to death. He sent them into the parts north of where he's of the other tribes. When Rehoboam heard of Adoram's death, he fled to Shechem, from Shechem to Jerusalem. In chapter 12, verses 21 through 24, Rehoboam immediately began gathering his army for war. From the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, he gathered 180,000 soldiers. The Lord sent a prophet, Shemaiah, who commanded Rehoboam not to attack the northern tribes. Rehoboam obeyed the Lord's commandment and dispersed his army. Continuing in verse 12, verses 25. Jeroboam established his capital for the time in Shechem. He built Penuel, east of Jordan, on the Jabbok River. Jeroboam correctly saw that the temple of Jerusalem, to which all the men of Israel were required to journey 3 times a year. Remember, they had those three festivals or 3 celebrations they had of the Passover, Feast of the Pentecost, and Feast of the Temples. This posed a threat to him, keeping the kingdom loyal to him. Therefore, he established a rival system to worship at Bethel and Dan. He erected 2 golden calves as idols of Jehovah. He told Israel, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt." He's referring back to the Moses' journey through the wilderness. This historian plainly says, "And this thing became a sin." Chapter 12, verse 30. In addition to the idols and change of location of worship, Jeroboam also made priests out of every tribe, used various high places for offering worship instead of the one altar at the temple, and instituted a holy day to revival the Feast of the Tabernacles. Verse 32. The worship was devised of his own heart and unrevealed worship. Remember that in the temple, God dwelt in the temple. That's what Solomon built. The cloud went in there, and that's where God was at. What Jeroboam has done now is he has established a place for the other tribes in the north to go and worship, but this is not the true worship that God wanted. The historian correctly assessed the negative impact this worship had on the nation of Israel. Writing redemption history, the historian saw that this apostasy was a poor beginning for the new nation. Into chapter 13, verses 1 through 34. The Lord sent an unnamed man of God from Judah to redeem the worship of Bethel. As he stood there, the altar of Bethel, he said, "O altar, altar, thus saith the Lord, behold, a child was born unto the house of David, Josiah by name, and upon thee shall he offer the priest of the high places that burn incense upon thee, and men's bones shall be burnt upon thee." As a sign that what he spoke was the word of God, the young prophet announced that the altar would split open and the ashes would pour out underneath it. When Jeroboam heard the words of the young prophet, he stretched out his hand, ordering that he be seized. His hand dried up so that he could not pull it back. And the altar was split open, and ashes poured out, just as the young prophet had said. Jeroboam asked the young prophet to entreat the Lord to him that his hand might be restored. And the young prophet prayed, and Jeroboam's hand was restored. Jeroboam invited the young prophet into his home and offered him a reward. But he had refused to go. God had commanded him not to eat in Bethel, nor to return some other way that he came, probably so that no one would follow him. The young prophet, having dutifully obeyed the Lord's commandment, turned toward home. There was a dwelling in Bethel, an older prophet. The older prophet had been obedient to the Lord. He would have been preaching against the idolatry and worship innovations that Jeroboam had introduced. When his sons told him what had happened at the altar of Bethel, he asked his son which way the young man headed. They told the father, and he saddled up his ass to ride. The older prophet caught up with the younger prophet as he had headed back to Jerusalem. He invited the younger prophet into his home for a meal. The younger prophet refused to go, telling the older prophet the Lord commanded. The older prophet told the younger prophet that the angel had told him to bring the younger prophet back home with him that he may eat. But he lied. The older prophet lied to the younger prophet. So the younger prophet went back to Bethel and ate at the older prophet's house in disobedience to God. Continuing in that same set of paragraphs. While the two prophets were eating, the word of God came to the younger prophet. He said, "For as much as thou hast disobeyed the mouth of the Lord, thou hast not kept the commandment which the Lord thy God commanded thee, but camest back and hast eaten bread and drank water in the place. For the which the Lord did say to thee, Eat no bread, drink no water. Thy carcass shall not come into the sepulchre of thy fathers." Verses 21 and 22. After the young man finished his meal and headed home, he had gone about a short way when a lion killed him in the way. To show that his death was from God, the lion did not eat the body, nor did it kill the ass on which he rode. The news of the young prophet's death reached the older prophet. He went after the body and gave it an honorable burial in his own grave. He asked that his sons bury his body with the younger prophet at his death. After these things, Jeroboam continued in his disobedience to God. He made priest of whoever wished of the lowest of the people. Hold on just a moment. What Jeroboam's doing right now is he is making a priest of anyone who wanted to be a priest out of the tribe of Levi. Sounds like a way to destruction. Chapter 14, verses 1 through 20. Sometime later, Jeroboam's son, Abijah, became sick. Jeroboam sent his wife to the prophet Ahijah at Shiloh, disguised as someone else. She was instructed to take gifts to the prophet and ask him if the child would recover his health. Ahijah was an old man who could not see well, but the Lord told him that the wife of Jeroboam was coming to ask him about her son. When Ahijah heard her coming to the door, he said, "Come in, thy wife of Jeroboam." Verses 6. The prophet announced to Jeroboam's wife that God's judgment rested on Jeroboam because of his transgressions. Therefore, the Lord would bring evil to the house of Jeroboam, cutting off every male descendant of the king. Those descendants of Jeroboam who died in the city would be eaten by dogs, and those who died in the field would be devoured by the birds of prey. Side note on that is to die and not be buried was a disgrace. He further announced that he further announced that when her feet entered the city of Tirzah, her son would die. Verse 12. This would be the only son of King Jeroboam. He would have an honorable burial, and that because the Lord saw something good in him. The Lord promised to raise up the king who would cut off the descendants of Jeroboam. This was fulfilled in the rebellion of Baasha in chapter 15. The Lord condemned Jeroboam because of his idolatry. Ahijah's words came true. When Jeroboam's wife returned to Bethel, her son died. All of Israel mourned his death and attended his funeral. Jeroboam reigned for 22 years and was succeeded by his son Nadab. Verses 21 through 31, chapter 14. Rehoboam began his reign when he was 41 years old and reigned for 17 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Naamah, an Ammoritess. In the early years, Rehoboam's kingdom was strengthened by Levites and priests from Israel who fled to Judah because of Jeroboam's apostasy. In this part of his region, Rehoboam was able to fortify cities of Judah. During the latter part of Rehoboam's reign, Judah was guilty of apostasy involving these sins: building high places to worship God. Throughout the rest of this lesson, we're going to refer to high places. And these are hills or places built by man, either geographical or by the hand of God for building structures to put idols on. Building high places to worship God. Idolatry. And third thing was sodomites. The word sidebar here is, the word sodomite is translated from Kaddish, which is defined as follows: speck of male prostitute, a Canaanite, sodomite, Kenatos, is called as consecrated to the service of Astarte or Venus. These wretched beings were priests and other temple servants, as Astarte and Hierapolis in Syria, and having been emasculated and wearing a female dress, they wandered about through the cities and villages, begging and bearing with them an image of the goddess. They were courted by females and given themselves up to unnatural lust. Sodomites were allowed to dwell peacefully in the... I've had trouble with this ever since I started reading and tried to figure this out. The third thing that's probably is the Sodomites, who were allowed to dwell peacefully in the land. Judah imitated the heathen nations around them. As a punishment to Judah, God sent Shishak, king of Egypt, against Jerusalem. Shishak's invasion is pictured on the south wall of the temple of Ammon in Karnak. The picture shows him having overrun 150 cities during this invasion. Many of these cities were in the southern Judah. Now remember, we've gone south. Rehoboam, Solomon's descendant. Rehoboam paid tribute to Shishak. To buy him off, he raised funds for the tribute. Rehoboam looted the temple and the king's palace, especially taking the shields of gold that Solomon had made. Rehoboam replaced the gold shields with brass ones, which were placed in charge of the chief of the guard, who brought them out for ceremonial display. Shishak's invasion humbled Rehoboam, and the Lord's wrath was turned from him. Throughout Rehoboam's reign, the hostilities continued between Israel and Judah. That's between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Rehoboam died and was succeeded by his son Abijam, called Adonijah. And that concludes those two individuals. They both died and left him over. Into chapter 15, in the reign of Abijam in Judah, that's the southern part. I'm going to keep reminding you of this so you can keep up with me. In the southern part, In the 18th year of Jeroboam's reign, Abijam succeeded Rehoboam. His mother's name was Micaiah, the daughter of Abishalom. Just to let you know who this is, in 2 Chronicles, the mother is named Micaiah, the daughter of Uriel of Gibeah. Discussions of these differences appear in most commentaries. Micaiah changed her name to Micaiah when she became wife of Rehoboam. Absalom, the son of David, and that Micaiah was the daughter of Thamar, who married Uriel of Gibeah, making her the granddaughter of Absalom. So the lineage is still there with everybody. He reigned just 3 years, continuing the sins of Rehoboam. The Lord allowed the kingdom to abide under Abijam's rule only for the sake of David. During his reign, Abijam won a major battle against Jeroboam in which 500,000 Israelites were slain. Abijam died and was succeeded by Asa. Chapter 15, verses 9 through 24. Asa became king in the 20th year of Jeroboam's reign. Chapter 15, verse 9. Just to update you here on Abijam, is notice that Abijam became king in the 18th year of Jeroboam and reigned 3 years. Asa became king in the 20th year, not the 21st year, as might be expected of Jeroboam. This shows that the Jewish chronology, any part of a year was considered a year. Abijam ruled 2 years and a few months. One thing I would like for you to remember is throughout this study, these times that they serve will be overlapped. And we're going through this real quick, and it goes through it real fast. And this is what I don't want you to do, is get confused. So I'm going to slow down just a little bit, and we're going to take care of these names. Now, Asa, back up here to this note. Asa is the third one. We had, memory left me. We had King David, King Solomon, Jeroboam in Israel, Rehoboam in Judah. In Judah we had Abijam. And he just got finished with his, and Asa is taken over. Now this time period now is at 910 BC. We've covered 60 years already in this study. Asa ruled over Judah 41 years, giving the southern kingdom a period of peace and stability. Early in his reign, Jeroboam of Israel died. He also made many righteous reforms, including the following. Now, this is Asa. He removed the Sodomites from the land, number one. Number two, he removed the idols from that his fathers had made. Number three, he removed Micaiah from being the queen mother because of her idolatry. Verse 13. Nevertheless, he did not remove the high places where Jehovah was unscripturally worshipped. He dedicated silver, gold, and many vessels to the temple. Asa strengthened Judah by rebuilding fenced cities and won a very significant victory from Zerah in Ethiopia, who invaded Judah with 1 million soldiers. Baasha, king of Israel, invaded Judah and rebuilt Ramah as a fortified city just 5 miles north of Jerusalem. Verse 17. The purpose of rebuilding Ramah was to cut off the north side trade traffic. In this desperation, Asa solicited help from Ben-Hadad of Syria. He sent treasurers that had been back up, Bob. He sent treasuries that had been stored in the temple and the king's palace to buy his help. With Ben-Hadad's own expansionist plans, he needed little excuse to invade northern Israel. As he moved in from the north, smiting Ijon, Dan, Baal-Bath-Micah, and all Naphtali, Baasha was forced to withdraw from Ramah. Asa quickly conscripted labor to take Baasha's building materials from Ramah to build Geba and Mizpah of Benjamin. The prophet Hananiah rebuked Asa for resorting to the Syrians for help rather than trusting the Lord. Asa did not receive his rebuke well. Instead, he put Hananiah in prison. In his old age, Asa became deceased in his feet. Unlike Hezekiah, who sought the Lord's help in his illness, Asa did not turn to the Lord. Instead, he relied solely on physicians. After he died, Jehoshaphat ascended him to the throne of Judah. Finishing up chapter 15, verses 25 through 32. Having taken the history of Judah through the death of Asa, the historian backs up his resume, the history of Israel, which he left at the death of Jeroboam. In the second year of Asa, Jeroboam died and was succeeded by his son Nadab. He reigned for 2 years. A little side note here from chapter 15, verse 28, we see that Nadab not only reigned a year and a few months. Nadab continued in the wicked ways of his father Jeroboam. Nadab laid siege to Gibbethon of the Philistines. While the army was in siege, Baasha conspired against Nadab and assassinated him. Having assumed control of the government, Baasha killed all of Jeroboam's descendants. A side note here on this is the putting of death into the descendants of Jeroboam was a fulfillment of the prophecy of Ahijah that was given to Jeroboam's wife on the occasion of her son's illness back in chapter 14, verses 7 through 11. What we're going to do is we're going to halt right there. We're going to start into chapter 16 next week, ladies. Next week we're having our meeting, so it'll be in 2 weeks. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions of how you cannot get any more confused than what is already there, I'll try and help you out as best I can. Thank you for your attention. That'll be the all for today. Thank you.